The following program contains descriptions of violence and suggestive topics that may not be appropriate for younger audiences. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to The American Narrative, Histories of a Nation, a podcast series by Discover America. I'm your host, Tim Murphy, along with my good friend and fellow history enthusiast, Grant Shea. Welcome to the inaugural episode.
Excited to be here, man. Excited for the journey and excited to explore all these interesting moments in history.
This project has been a work in progress for several years, so it's just an absolutely amazing feeling that it's finally ready to launch. For all those familiar with the Discover America blog or read my articles in the past, thank you. None of this would have been possible without your encouragement and support. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. Hope you're ready to learn some American history. Ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's get to it.
All right, here we go. Today, we'll be discussing the Fishing Creek Confederacy, the biggest wild goose chase of the American Civil War. So we typically think of the Civil War as a battle between North and South. However, from a political party standpoint, that division isn't quite as clear-cut. Did you know there were four major candidates in the presidential election of 1860?
I did not. No, Lincoln and what's his name? The main guy, the guy who lost to Lincoln. I'm gonna need your help here, Tim.
We'll jump into it. Yeah. So, going to the Democratic National Convention, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. That's the guy. Yeah. So he was projected to secure the party's presidential nomination. And he was a proponent of popular sovereignty, which was the political doctrine that allowed residents of Western territories to decide democratically whether to allow or prohibit slavery. So he authored the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively repealed the legal precedent set by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And that Missouri Compromise established the 3630 parallel as a dividing line between slave states and free states. But popular sovereignty was not a full-fledged endorsement for slavery's unhindered expansion into the West. And Douglas's relatively soft stance drew the ire of radical Deep South Democrats, and they were called fire eaters, who threatened secession in the absence of more stringent slave codes. The DNC assembled in Charleston, South Carolina between April 23rd and May 3rd, 1860. Throughout the convention, staunch secessionists fear-mongered their colleagues, decrying Northern violence and the Republicans' intention to forcibly emancipate African Americans. Douglas refused to entertain such rhetoric, thinking it would alienate moderate Democrats in the North and Midwest. So as a result, 50 fire eaters walked out, protesting Douglas's platform. The Democrats issued 57 ballots during the convention. Each time, Douglas failed to achieve the two-thirds majority necessary for the party's official endorsement.
Wow.
So they left, and there was no candidate.
Wow.
So they reconvened in Baltimore, Maryland in June 1860. And this time, 110 delegates walked out of the convention, and the remaining members elected Douglas as their nominee. So those dissenting Democrats formed their own faction called the Seceders Convention and appointed the then vice president and Kentucky native John Breckinridge. So all this contentious infighting and sectionalism had fractured the Democratic Party. And then there was John Bell. Do you know who John Bell is?
The name rings a bell, but no, just kidding. But yeah, no, I don't.
So John Bell, he was the candidate for the Constitutional Union Party.
Okay.
So allow me to bring Mr. Bell out of historical obscurity here for a second. So he was a career politician from Tennessee who, to put it lightly, had commitment issues. So he was originally a Jacksonian Democrat, first elected to the House in 1827. He won 7 consecutive terms, and he even served as Speaker of the House from 1833 to 1835, beating out future President James Knox Polk for the position. So he was pretty popular. However, after the election of 1836, Bell switched his affiliation to the Whig Party. When fellow Whig William Henry Harrison ascended to the presidency in 1840, Bell was appointed Secretary of War. Unfortunately, Harrison died 1 month into his term, and Bell resigned from his position shortly after John Tyler took office. In 1847, Bell was elected to the Senate, where his allegiances varied between the Whigs, opposition, and know-nothing parties. Although a slaveholder himself, Bell refuted slavery's expansion into the West. He was the only senator from a southern state who opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he later voted against Kansas's admission to the Union as a slave state. In 1860, Bell became the presidential nominee for the newly formed Constitutional Union Party. Edward Everett, the president of Harvard and former Whig governor of Massachusetts, served as his vice presidential running mate. Constitutional Unionists endorsed no political principle other than the Constitution and maintained a rather ambiguous view on the hot-button issue of slavery. Their slogan was, "No North, no South, no East, no West, nothing but the Union." It was an attempt to counter the partisan sectional politics of the day, which fell flat across the board. Bell ended up receiving 12.5% of the popular vote and carried the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, which equated to about 13% of the electorate.
Border states, though, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. And for like a third party, that's a pretty substantial
chunk. That's not bad. Not at all. No.
Yeah.
Very
and then finally, we have your winner of the 1860 presidential election, Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
So Lincoln received 180 electoral votes, which was about 59.5%, but he only garnered 39.8% of the popular vote. So the Republican Party's platform denounced the expansion of slavery as a, quote, dangerous political heresy that directly contradicted the vision of the Founding Fathers. Lincoln himself supported free soil and containment policies, but did not initially endorse immediate emancipation like many radical Republicans. Nevertheless, many Democrats viewed Lincoln's election as a segue for abolitionist policies and racial equality. Although the state of Pennsylvania voted Republican in 1860, it had voted Democrat during 3 of the last 4 election cycles, and many counties in central and western Pennsylvania, like Columbia County, remained strong supporters of the Democratic Party. The majority of eligible voters in these counties were working-class white males, who labored as miners, mechanics, and lumbermen. From their perspective, the existence of slavery was inconsequential to their livelihoods, and it was not the place of the federal government to interfere in what was considered a states' rights issue. During the secession crisis, political discord became increasingly partisan and hyperbolic. While many Northern Democrats viewed Southern secession as unconstitutional and reluctantly supported military intervention, a faction of anti-administration, anti-war advocates wanted to mitigate conflict at any cost. That included codifying slavery's expansion or allowing peaceful separation. Republicans labeled these so-called peace Democrats copperheads, poisonous snakes of American democracy. After the firing on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the Union Army, hoping to quash the insurrection in 90 days. Despite the ongoing political rancor, most Northerners united against the rebellion, riding an upswell of patriotism. Levi Tate, a staunch Democrat and longtime newspaper editor for the Columbia Democrat, reported, "Now that war has commenced, no matter who is at fault, it is the duty of all our citizens, irrespective of party, to stand by the old flag with its glorious stars and stripes and support the government in all proper and legitimate efforts to bring the contest to a successful issue. It becomes the duty of every patriot to lend his aid in sustaining the honor and glory of our common country." However, the Confederate States proved to be formidable adversaries. As months of conflict turned into years, the patriotic fervor and romanticism of war began to dwindle. Federal authorities found recruitment efforts increasingly difficult to satisfy. On July 17, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Militia Act into law. This legislation required all able-bodied male citizens, ages 18 to 45, to enlist in the state militias and permitted African Americans to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. Each state was given a volunteer quota proportional to its population, as prescribed by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. If a state failed to satisfy their quotas, governors were authorized to institute a special draft from the militia rolls to make up the difference.
Something I always think is interesting, too, with the constitutionality and the argument of and how that relates to slavery is, the Dred Scott decision, which I'm sure you know of, and it's one of the most, I think, wrongful but also just famous Supreme Court decisions. It really hinges on I think I'm forgetting which amendment it is off the top of my head, but the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the right to unlawful seizure of property. What the decision did is it turned the wording on its head, And instead of providing that slavery unconstitutionally deprives people of their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and property without due process, what they did is they interpreted that the Constitution to read that what abolishing slavery would do is deprive slave owners of their right to property, i.e., slaves. And, there's one dissenting justice who, scathing dissent, just saying, how could you read the Constitution this way? But it kind of goes to show, and I always think it's just interesting how, our judges, our, elected officials will interpret language in the Constitution in such diametrically opposed ways depending on the narrative that they're trying to advance. And, we're reading the same words, but we're reaching such fundamentally different conclusions. It's something that I just, as a lawyer, I always find that interesting. But
yeah, it's definitely up to interpretation. Yeah. And sometimes the interpretation's intentional, other times it's unintentional, and that's just the opinion. But that's what law is. Essentially, it's opinion. It's opinion that's enforced. The threat of conscription spurred volunteering. Pennsylvania furnished over 40,000 soldiers. Another 15 were enrolled via state militia draft. However, these draft calls were inconsistently administered and poorly enforced. On March 3, 1863, Congress passed the Enrollment Act, the first federal conscription law authorizing a nationwide draft. Provost Marshal General James Barnett Frye oversaw national enlistment and draft registration efforts. Assistant provost marshals supervised state-level operations. Bigger states, like Pennsylvania, were partitioned into divisions to ease the jurisdictional burden. Major Charles C. Gilbert served as the assistant provost marshal for Pennsylvania's Eastern Division. Lieutenant Colonel James Vody Bomford managed the West. State congressional districts became federal draft districts, each under the direction of a deputy provost marshal. Captain Charles M. Manville supervised the 13th District of Pennsylvania's Western Division, which included Columbia, Montour, Sullivan, Wyoming, and Bradford counties. District enrollment officers recorded the names and occupations of all male citizens between the ages of 20 and 45 and registered them for the draft lottery. However, this was a difficult task to accomplish. Throughout Pennsylvania and much of the North, many field representatives were given false information, faced verbal abuse, or were physically assaulted during their rounds. Their lives were threatened in the name of draft resistance. Draft offices were routinely robbed and their contents destroyed. Much like the specifications of the 1862 Militia Act, if a district failed to fulfill their predetermined recruitment quota, the draft lottery was introduced to make up the difference. If an individual's name was drawn, they would have three options. 1. Report to the district draft office for medical examination. 2. Hire a substitute to take their place, and these substitutes were usually teenagers or immigrants from other districts. Or 3. Pay a $300 commutation fee, which only the wealthy could afford. So these monetary-based military exemptions gave credence to a rich man's war, poor man's fight, and led to widespread opposition, civil unrest, and occasional mob violence. Most infamously, the New York City draft riots, which deserves its own episode entirely. In Columbia County, residents were indignant over these controversial draft lotteries. Many felt they were unfairly targeted due to their Democratic affiliations. Their draft numbers grossly disproportionate to neighboring Republican-leaning districts. Moreover, some citizens claimed that members of the Provost Marshal's office withdrew the names of well-connected Republicans from the draft wheels, which made these lotteries of death more likely to select names of Democrats. County representatives resolved, quote, "A war carried on contrary to the rules and provisions of the Constitution, whether it be a crusade against slavery, or any other fanatical or delusory scheme, never can and never will receive our support." This quote alludes to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which altered the basic premise of the Civil War from preserving the Union to freeing the slaves. This brooding dissent only amplified desertion rates. In July 1863, following Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and the catastrophic battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the War Department issued a nationwide call for 300,000 troops. Districts that failed to satisfy their quotas were subject to the national draft. Columbia County's quota was 634. The national draft commenced on September 17th. 618 people were drafted from Columbia County, of whom 75% evaded. So only 16 people actually volunteered from Columbia County. And then, doing the math off the top of my head, about 400 people evaded the draft.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
In response to the widespread desertion, Provost Marshal Fry ordered his deputies to appoint up to 4 special agents to track down and apprehend delinquent draftees. There was a provision in the Enrollment Act that allowed any person, soldier or civilian, to assume this role. These agents, essentially bounty hunters, were incentivized with $5 a head, which later increased to $30. But finding draft dodgers was dangerous work. As Provost Marshal Fry recalled, the Conscription Act was regarded by the disloyal portion of the people as arbitrary and inhuman, and their passions and feelings were worked upon by the disloyal press to such an extent that violence was frequently offered to the enrolling officer. In the case of Richard Stiles, an enrolling officer from Benton Township, Pennsylvania, a coffin was placed at his door with an anonymous letter nailed to it, threatening his life if he continued to, quote, drag men from their homes to be slaughtered down south. On several tragic occasions, threats were fulfilled. Of the 38 enrollment officers killed in the line of duty, 3 were slain in Pennsylvania's Western District. On June 3, 1864, another state-sanctioned draft was instituted in Pennsylvania's 13th District. This time, 636 names were drawn from Columbia County, and again, the draft was met with mass desertion. On July 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel Bomford was relieved from duty as acting assistant provost marshal for Pennsylvania's Western District, the result of mounting political pressure from state legislators and the War Department. He was replaced by Major Richard I. Dodge, who was not particularly fond of central Pennsylvania's civilian population, calling him, quote, the very worst class of beings, both native and foreign, to be found in this country. Now here's where the controversy begins. On July 31st, 1864, a mounted squadron of discharged Union soldiers, known as Lincoln's Midnight Raiders, rode into Columbia County looking for deserters. The armed posse converged upon the home of Thomas Smith, a resident of Benton Township, but Smith managed to avoid apprehension by fleeing into a nearby cornfield. Smith's wife caused quite a commotion. She reportedly blew a bugle and screamed at the top of her lungs, alerting her neighbors about the presence of the armed bounty hunters. Thomas met up with his brother Minor and their friend Ellis Young, both of whom were also deserters from military service. The treasonous trio armed themselves and headed down the main road towards Thomas's house. Along the way, they encountered the Midnight Raiders. The posse's leader, 29-year-old Lieutenant James Stewart Robertson, a veteran of the 7th Pennsylvania Reserves, ordered the men to halt. Suddenly, shots rang out. It remains unclear who fired first, but Lieutenant Robertson sustained a bullet wound to his abdomen. The deserters fled the scene with the Midnight Raiders giving chase. After a quarter-mile pursuit, the Union horsemen gave up and returned to their fallen comrade. Gravely wounded, Robinson was transported to a neighbor's wagon shed, where a local physician, Dr. John Chapin, treated his wounds through the early morning hours. He was later transferred to the home of A.N. Harvey in Huntington Township, Luzerne County. On August 1st, Captain William Silver informed Major Dodge of the circumstances surrounding Robinson's shooting. He reported that the 13th District, specifically Columbia County, was, quote, infested with deserters in large numbers, fully armed, and declared themselves ready to resist to death. Major Dodge relayed the information to Provost Marshal Fry on August 3rd. Dodge, quote, I am credibly informed that there are large bands of deserters and delinquent drafted men, banded together, armed, and organized for resistance to the U.S. authorities. My plan is to enter one county with a force sufficiently strong, not only to put down, but to overawe resistance, to remain in that county until every deserter, delinquent drafted man, and abettor of rebellion be arrested or run out of the county. When that is done, proceed to another. The startling news from central Pennsylvania worked its way up the chain of command to Major General Henry W. Halleck, the Union Army's chief of staff, who authorized military intervention. The violent encounter quickly made headline news. On August 6th, the Columbia Democrat reported the following, quote, we learned that on last Sunday morning about 2 o'clock, a party of 9 or 10 men claiming to be authorized to arrest non-reporting drafted men came to the house of a man named Smith in the upper end of the county, and having effect and entrance inquired for the person of whom they were in search. They were informed that he was absent, and the party left on the hunt of him. It is said that the woman who was at the house rang a bell or blowed a horn, or both, upon the retirement of the Lincoln Midnight Raiders. After leaving the house, they passed in a body up the road, and within a mile met 3 men, whom they immediately ordered to halt, with the threat to shoot them. The reply was, "We play that game too," and on the word fired. One of the 9 fell. 8 men discharged their revolvers at the 3, and then took to the woods, leaving their wounded comrade in the road. Aid was promptly awarded to him, and at this writing he is still alive. We trust he may recover, and that this first may also be the last affair of the kind we may have to chronicle. End quote. On August 13th, 48 Union soldiers and 2 artillery pieces under command of Captain Bruce Lambert arrived in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Reports poured in that an additional 250 troops were en route. Democrats throughout Columbia County were extremely concerned. Did the arrival of troops indicate martial law? Had the military planned mass arrests? Would these outsiders seize and destroy their property? On August 14th, the citizens of Benton, Pennsylvania, assembled in the barn of John Rance to discuss these and many other questions. While the majority of attendees expressed pacifist tendencies, a group of 75 rebels, led by Jacob Schultz, Edward McHenry, and Samuel Klein, declared that they were prepared to combat their county's military occupation with armed resistance. When the Rance meeting adjourned, Samuel Klein performed a reconnaissance mission against the approaching Union Army. Upon discovering the overwhelming strength of federal forces, Klein and several of his co-conspirators promptly fled to North Mountain near the headwaters of Fishing Creek. Rumors circulated around Columbia County, speculating the extent of this armed draft resistance. Local informants claimed that these rebellious citizens were actually part of a larger conspiracy. The Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society of Confederate sympathizers and political extremists, had recruited hundreds of heavily armed insurgents and constructed an earthen fort on North Mountain. One soldier noted that the people of Bloomsburg, quote, told us terrific stories of forts and breastworks, garrisoned with well-armed and desperate men, to the number of 4,000. This number was said to be composed of deserters, bounty jumpers, and copperheads, who had sworn to fight to the death sooner than submit to the coming draft.
It's interesting, though. All the, people don't talk about the draft during the Civil War as much. And I think it's interesting to point out how, the draft people often associate it, I guess, with Vietnam, but World War II, Civil War. I don't know about World War One. How was it? I don't even know if there was a draft for World War One, but
I don't know how big the standing army was in World War One, because we were neutral for the longest time, and then we went to war.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's just like drafts are not, they've happened many a times, and I guess just thinking about it in my head, this would be one of the longest periods of time since the last draft. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think drafts were more common but on the state level, because the states had the militias, and that was the main military force before the federal government had, a strong standing army.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of why the Confederacy was able to do what they did, because we didn't have the bodies to prevent that. But yeah.
And then it's like, I wonder if there'd ever be. Do you think there'd ever be another? I mean, because I think about it, and it's like, I think in the atomic age, like America, I feel like it'd be very hard. Like, I know Ukraine has a draft right now, but I wonder if America would ever have a draft again. I wouldn't say never, but I'd be interested, like, what would prompt that, Because, anyway, I'm just
never rule it out.
yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, but before the Enrollment Act was passed, the draft was a state rule.
Yeah.
It was their duty to enforce the draft, and since they were doing such a bad job at it, the federal government was like, "All right, we're taking over."
That's so interesting. I never knew. Like, that's something that I feel like, I mean, it's just, again, crazy how much sovereignty and autonomy the states had throughout history, and how it's really just in the history of our country, I guess. It's kind of like a more recent development. The authority of the federal government over the states, like, I guess, whatever, like the last 100 years or so, but this country
it's become increasingly bureaucratic.
Yeah, interesting.
Takes the fun out of it.
Oh, God.
It should be noted that most, if not all, Union informants were Republican sympathizers. As additional troops continued to arrive, Captain Silver worked with cooperative citizens to compile a list of men to be arrested, many of whom were social or political rivals. On August 16th, Major General Darius Couch, commander of the Department of the Susquehanna, arrived in Bloomsburg to supervise the operation. He brought with him Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stewart and another 4 companies of infantry. As a gesture of goodwill and an effort to mitigate any unnecessary bloodshed, General Couch decided to grant deserters clemency if they reported to the Bloomsburg Draft Office for examination by August 20th. It was Couch's impression that, quote, these men are not guilty in comparison to the leaders living in that section who have taught them that the draft was unconstitutional. Colonel John Goss Freeze spread Couch's message throughout the upper reaches of Columbia County, scouting for any rebel fortifications in the process. He returned to General Couch the following day and reported, quote, there will be no resistance by any citizens to arrest the alleged deserters. Claiming no imminent danger, Freeze proposed for Couch to personally accompany him during his search for the reported fort, but the general declined. Instead, Couch met with U.S. Senator Charles Buckaloo, a Democratic politician from Fishing Creek Township, to discuss the federal occupation of his county. According to Colonel Freeze, quote, when General Couch first arrived in Bloomsburg, he called upon Senator Buckaloo and detailed to him his dreadful story of insurrection in the Fishing Creek country. He insisted that it was very extensive and dangerous, and that it represented that Colonel Samuel Klein was the leader. Mr. Buckaloo's reply was, as we are informed, he had no particular information of what occurred in the Creek region beyond newspaper statements, that he did not believe there was any general combination of the inhabitants to resist the draft, that the statement about Colonel Klein was inconsistent with the character of that gentleman and was no doubt a falsehood. August 20th came and went. No deserters heeded Couch's call. The next day, Couch dispatched nearly 1,000 Union soldiers to scour Columbia County for the rebel outpost. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart began collecting information in Benton. There are no copperheads or armed men here now, wrote Stewart. They are all loyal, law-abiding citizens, bringing in provisions and inviting officers out to meals and paying us every attention. For over a week, Federal scouting parties were unsuccessful in their effort to locate enemy fortifications. Frustrated and exceedingly bored, some unruly soldiers directed their energies to, quote, robbing hen roosts, trampling down cornfields, and capturing companies of hogs. Democratic pundits were outraged by this military occupation and gross overstep of federal authority. On August 26, 1864, the Democratic Watchman, a newspaper from Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, read the following. Fellow countrymen, do you observe the intentions of the despot in response to the mobilization of Union troops? Nerve yourselves with valor. Arm yourselves for fight. Prepare for a bitter end. Better let the fertile soil of your valleys be drenched with your blood. Better to die amid the smoldering ruins of your cities, towns, and dwellings. Better to rend the heavens with your dying shrieks and groans than to suffer the fiendish impostor who has enthroned himself at Washington to rivet the chains of slavery upon you. Freeman the torch. Apply it to your homes, your property. Snatch the plunder and luxury from the Vandals. Perish, perish, perish with your liberties.
You know, I think that it's I think beyond, you know, even just how you know, ridiculous that sounds, but at the same time, I think it's a reminder that, you know, we don't hear these stories enough of these types of articles that were written during this time. Like we hear the big glossy overview of, you know, the history, but these narratives are happening. Like they happened then, and I think it's important to realize that, you know, they didn't win the day, or they might not have even been the dominant thought, but they were read, and the thoughts were being shared, and it helps us make sense of today when there's just this. It's chaos. You're hearing so many different narratives from so many different places, but you know, and we think it's so novel and new, but I think it's telling that people back then were dealing with stuff like that too. Yeah. You know, we're not, you know, people generally stay the same. It's the mediums and the technology that changes. It's just cool to me.
We think our current society is like super partisan, like
that.
These.
Yeah, I
mean, can't write like, that nowadays.
That's. I hope we don't. Yeah, like, my God. But man, crazy stuff. But interesting, very, very interesting. What was the name of that newspaper?
The Democratic Watchman.
Okay. So there are a few publications from that time that I'm aware of. But I feel like these are just kind of those more, I don't want to say less renowned, or just, these are like local news. It's just, the local
this
the
is
local
Central
newspaper.
Pennsylvania news.
Yeah. It's like you turn on your local News 12 or whatever. This is what you're hearing back in. Crazy. Very, very interesting. Cool stuff, Tim. Very cool stuff.
Another anonymous letter likened Lincoln to King George III, allowing the quartering of troops among civilians and inciting domestic insurrections. Republican editors fired back, claiming truth to the organized pro-Southern conspiracy in Columbia County. As reported by Forney's War Press on September 14, 1864, quote, "There are parts in Pennsylvania where the forests and the skulls of human heads are so thick that it is but seldom that the bright rays of soul can penetrate the one or the rays of intellect the other. Such forests and such skulls you can find if you take a trip to Columbia, Lycoming, and Sullivan, and other counties watered by the headwaters of the west and north branches of the Susquehanna. There, my dear press, you will find the deep, almost impenetrable forests and the equally thick human skulls. There is the birthplace of the changeling Fishing Creek Confederacy."
See, why can't we? Why don't people, when they're trying to diss each other, let's use that kind of vocabulary, enough of these buzzwords and mean. Let's be creative. I can respect.
That's almost Shakespearean right there.
What? Oh my gosh.
On August 27th, Major General George Cadwalader. Oh god, I'm gonna mess this name up so bad. Cadwalader. Okay. Cadwalader. It's a weird name. I put it in parentheses just so I could say it.
You can even say, you can be like, I don't even know how to.
On August 27th, Major General George Cadwalader took command of Union troops in Columbia County. Accompanying the general were members of the 16th Regiment of the Veteran Reserve Corps, also known as the Invalid Corps, men physically unable to perform field duties who wished to remain in the Army. On August 31st, after countless hours of searching and information gathering, Union leadership issued arrest warrants for 100 Copperhead civilians for, quote, "uniting, confederating, and combining with other disloyal persons, resisting execution of the draft, and preventing persons who have been drafted from enlisting into military service of the United States." Those arrested were brought to Christian Church outside of Benton for legal examination. No opportunity was provided for defense. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart oversaw the proceedings and ultimately issued judgment. 55 were acquitted without reprieve. The remaining 45 were charged with disloyalty to the U.S. government. Among those imprisoned were a judge, county treasurer, state legislators, and a reverend. Only one man was an actual draft evader. The detainees were transferred to Fort Mifflin, arriving on September 2nd, where they remained imprisoned in an underground bomb-proof for several months. The Columbia Democrat reported, quote, "These men were summarily kidnapped and incarcerated in filthy bastilles by the minions of the Lincoln dynasty, in direct violation of the laws of the United States and their own acts of Congress, and yet nearly half of their number are today pining their existence in those prisons of death and persecution." Another Democratic newspaper, the Star of the North, wrote, quote, "These victims of federal tyranny were hurried off without any preparation, without sufficient clothing, without being allowed to make any arrangements for the support of their families. As a consequence of this, a large section of the county is completely impoverished." The morning after the arrest, General Cadwalader marched his troops to the north end of the county and attempted to find the rebel fortifications. An extensive search yielded zero evidence of conspiracy. One soldier articulated, "Disloyalists are cowards. As soon as the excitement of bad whiskey had passed away, the mass of their force lost heart, and those men who had property to lose, who were in the ranks, suddenly became intensely loyal." Of the alleged uprising, the Major General himself admitted, quote, "The whole thing is a grand farce." On September 7th, General Cadwalader returned to Philadelphia. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart became the de facto supervisor of Union troops in Columbia County. Later that October, Stewart was replaced by Colonel Charles Albright, a staunch Republican who, according to Senator Buckaloo, made, quote, inflammatory speeches about the arrests and trying to arouse passions against the arrested parties. Albright's political partisanship only grew more audacious. On October 11th, the day preceding Pennsylvania's state elections, dozens of Democratic citizens throughout the 13th District were arrested without cause. They were only released once the ballots had closed. Local newspapers were outraged by this obvious example of unconstitutional political repression. As Colonel Fries recalled, quote, the military authorities were without any excuse whatsoever for continuing their occupation of the county and for holding our citizens in prison. For the troops traversed the whole course of Fishing Creek and ascertained beyond all question that there was no insurrection. And the nearer the presidential election of 1864 approached, the more overbearing became these government officials and employees. No man was allowed to speak freely against or criticize or condemn the course of the dominant party. In addition to arrests, federal authorities gathered information about the Columbia County citizens incarcerated at Fort Mifflin. They obtained several dozen affidavits, a few of which we have to share. Martha Colley, whose brother-in-law, Stott Colley, was among the Mifflin imprisoned, testified that she heard Stott's cellmate, Joseph Van Sickle, say to another man that if the soldiers came up, he would, quote, blow some of their goddamned abolition heads to hell. Another...
You know what's interesting to me, though? So, like, that's her affidavit, right? And she's saying she heard X say Y to Z kind of thing. That's hearsay. I mean,
it's all hearsay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's all... None of it can be substantiated.
But it's
I just find it so comical.
It's like, I wonder, I wonder. Very interesting.
Another witness, Thomas B. Cole, described Van Sickle as rather insane. Huntington Township resident William Forbes spoke against Reverend Alva R. Rutan. Forbes recalled how, 2 years ago, he had conversed with the Reverend about a recent battle. Rutan told him that, quote, he would like to see a ball put through Abraham Lincoln's heart. Forbes continued, I either called him a Tory or traitor, but do not remember which. He told me that if I called him that again, he would kick my ass. End quote.
So even back in the day that people said kick my ass.
Yeah.
I didn't know how...
It's an antiquated term, apparently.
Oh, man.
Many accusations centered around the Rance meeting, and how its attendees were secretly members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Edward McHenry, one of the armed rebel leaders, answered to this supposition as a government witness, providing his testimony in exchange for immunity. When asked whether there was a Knights of the Golden Circle organization in Columbia County, McHenry confirmed and claimed that there were, quote, great many members in the region. He even divulged passwords and hand signals used to identify fellow members. The accused were placed on military trial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, beginning October 17, 1864. The cases were brought before a 3-officer military commission. A 4th officer served as prosecuting attorney. Civilian lawyers from the Harrisburg area and Columbia County served as defense counsel. Colonel Albright decided to try the men for which there was an overwhelming array of evidence. Due to this restrictive criteria, only 14 trials were conducted. 8 were convicted of the charges: John Rance, Samuel Klein, William Appleman, Reverend Alva Rutan, Joseph Van Sickle, John Lemon, Benjamin Colley, and Valentine Fell. The remaining 6 were acquitted. Despite the convictions, the prosecution was unable to prove that the Knights of the Golden Circle played any significant role in Columbia County's armed draft resistance. By mid-January 1865, the military trials of Columbia County citizens were over. Those not prosecuted were simply released from their Harrisburg confinements. Unfortunately, one man, 56-year-old William Roberts, died while in captivity. While these trials were taking place, on November 3, 1864, Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart Robertson died of peritonitis. He was buried in Bethel Hill Cemetery in Fairmount Township, Pennsylvania. The inscription on his headstone reads, quote, was shot by a rebel sympathizer in Benton Township, Columbia County, Pennsylvania, while assisting a U.S. officer attempting to arrest deserters. The agonizing death of a fellow soldier had Union troops out for blood.
So So I just want to make sure I heard that right. So he died of peritonitis, but his inscription read that he was shot.
So he died of his wound.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Like he lingered for
4
months.
This is the same.
This is the same guy.
Wow.
So he was hanging on for 3 or 4 months.
I wasn't even connecting that. Okay. Wow.
There's a lot of names being.
But that's very interesting. That it's that same guy. Wow.
Yeah. So ultimately, he died of his wound.
Wow.
And so on November 5th, 3 soldiers arrived at the farmstead of Ezekiel Cole to arrest him for draft desertion. Cole was out hunting at the time, but his wife Elizabeth and 16-year-old son Leonard were home. Leonard was apprehended by the soldiers and dragged to the barn for interrogation. The questioning quickly devolved into torture. The soldiers placed a noose around Leonard's neck and used a crossbeam in the barn as a makeshift gallows. Leonard was repeatedly hoisted into the air, where he dangled for a minute or two before being released to the floor. Several lynching cycles took place before Elizabeth chased the soldiers out with a broomstick. The entire ordeal left Leonard blind and unable to speak. Thomas A. Gill, a 25-year-old soldier from Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, eventually admitted that he was the one who fashioned the noose, but wrote he merely pulled the rope with a gentle strain. Gill further refuted any lasting physical or neurological damage Leonard claimed to have suffered. Federal troops remained stationed in Columbia County during the general election of 1864. Union soldiers guarded the polls, supposedly to stop Democrats from voting, according to a local newspaper. Although voter turnout was 27% to 47% lower than the previous cycle, Columbia County still trended Democratic. The military occupation of Columbia County ended in early December.
So even though they supposedly were suppressing the vote, it was still ended up being Democratic. So it's like, it's interesting because now it just goes to show, especially like in today's day and age where all these people are commenting on voting and whatnot, but the results of the vote is kind of a barometer of which of those narratives that we've been discussing is having more influence, right?
Exactly.
I think that's one of those aspects of voting that I think people sometimes it's like it's implied, it's subconscious, but it's not always spoken about enough, which is that it's a good barometer of the narrative that is dominating the day beyond any even, beyond what's on the ground, what's happening, the reality. The narrative helps mold the reality helps mold the narrative, but the vote is always kind of a nice barometer, and that's, I think, one of the biggest values of voting. Democracy, if anything, is just helps ground your understanding of the narratives of the age. But that's just me
Case
riffing.
Go vote.
Exactly.
Go vote. In March 1865, Provost Marshal Fry dispatched an investigative committee to Columbia County to review the events that transpired there. The Federal Commission discovered that Captain Manville had recorded 11,237 men liable for military service in Pennsylvania's 13th District, when in fact the true figure was 6,685.
Wow.
So he basically doubled the number of available draftees.
Yeah.
So there was some truth to having a higher proportion of draftees in that county.
Yeah.
Captain Manville was relieved from duty immediately after this revelation.
Yeah.
The War Department released the Columbia County convicts in May 1865. Reverend Rutan was actually granted a presidential pardon earlier that February. Between August 29th and August 31st, 1865, a countrywide meeting of the Democratic Party assembled near the base of Knob Mountain in Columbia County. According to Levi Tate, quote, "The object of this meeting is to revive and strengthen popular confidence in the doctrines of Jefferson, which are now more than ever necessary to public salvation. Though trampled underfoot in high places and despised by those who prosper upon the calamities of their country, the speakers will maintain that all abuses in government should be arraigned at the bar of public reason, that state governments should be supported in all their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies, that we should have a jealous care of the right of election, resisting interference therewith by corruption or force, and uphold with our whole influence and power the supremacy of the civil over the military authority, and freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of person under the protection of habeas corpus, and trials by juries impartially selected. So pretty much it was a meeting to relive the past year or so in Columbia County.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too. The goals of the meeting. It seems like grounding. It seems more just let's get everything. Let's get back to the roots of what we how as you said, how it was before. It's interesting that that's and this was in 1865. This was after.
Yeah, this was after the war had ended. This is when Johnson's president now.
Interesting.
And he used
very
from the South.
Very staunch Democrat. Very as pretty much as was this still was this back when the vice president was still whoever received the second or. Did Lincoln choose Johnson to be his VP? Was that?
I think he did because he had what was it? What's his name? Hannibal.
Yeah, for his first term, he had that other guy.
A different vice president.
Yeah, I know.
Not Hannibal Lecter, but
I hope not.
Was it Hannibal Hamlin?
That name sounds familiar.
I don't know.
But
I'll have to look this up.
Yeah, Johnson. I remember. He's consistently ranked by historians as one of the. I always think too. I don't mean to digress, but I always think it's interesting too. There's so much focus when we talk about the Civil War on the 1860 to 1865, even some of those years before leading up to the Civil War. I think one of the most understudied or periods of American history that need to be talked about more because of the opportunity that was not wasted per se, but just the opportunity for change and for progress that was kind of squandered is that Reconstruction era, that 1865 to 1880, 1885. That it's not like nothing was happening during those years, but we just don't hear about it enough. And it's truly fascinating because I think if we had different leaders than Johnson and Chester A. Arthur, James A. Garfield, Ulysses S. Grant, it's just realize how different the trajectory could have been. And again, it's just we skip over. Then we go to 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson. We go to the 1890s and turn of the century, 1900s. But that it's like a gap in U.S. history that's just so fascinating as to how it kind of just set the foundation for the post-Civil War age. I don't know. It's just something I always try to geek out. I always try to learn more about the Reconstruction era. It's very, very interesting.
It is very interesting, and I'll definitely be putting on some episodes about Reconstruction.
That's awesome.
Especially, like
I'm excited for that.
How it's viewed as such a failure now.
Yeah.
It was because in 1876 it was Rutherford B. Hayes. They had that backroom deal.
Yeah.
In the Congress.
A lot of corruption during that era.
It was very corrupt. Yeah. It was very corrupt, which makes for a very juicy story. So we'll definitely explore that in some more detail. Cool. Don't you worry.
Very cool.
But going back to the that Knob Mountain Convention, during the convention, Colonel Victor P. Olay introduced the, quote, victims of fanaticism and persecution of the past year, and nearly 36 Fort Mifflin prisoners assembled on stage. The crowd responded with a prolonged standing ovation. The controversial military response to the Fishing Creek Confederacy provoked a burning legal question I think you might appreciate. Can citizens be tried before military courts? This debate reached the U.S. Supreme Court in April 1866, stemming from a separate incident in Indiana. In October 1864, Lambton P. Milligan and 4 accomplices were arrested by Union soldiers for conspiring to seize munitions from federal arsenals, incite insurrections, liberate Confederate prisoners of war, and engage in other disloyal practices. All were tried before a military commission and found guilty. Milligan and 3 others were sentenced to death by hanging on May 19, 1865. One man, Andrew Humphreys, was sentenced to hard labor for the remainder of the war. Shortly before the scheduled executions, Milligan's attorney Jonathan W. Gordon petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus to the U.S. Circuit Court in Indianapolis. He claimed that the military commission had no jurisdiction over Milligan since he was a citizen living in a non-rebellious state whose civil courts were still operational. The case was passed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously in Milligan's favor. Even though President Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus in September 1863, it did not authorize civilian prosecution by a military tribunal. Milligan had been denied his Sixth Amendment right to trial by an impartial jury, thus rendering his legal proceedings unconstitutional. The decision in Ex parte Milligan reaffirmed Democratic beliefs that the Fishing Creek Confederacy was a, quote, mere political raid for a little personal revenge. Now, that was a lot of information detailing a complex series of events. And just to recap, I'll read a few paragraphs from J.H. Battle's 1887 History of Columbia and Montour Counties, which provide an excellent and objective summation of events. On one side, it is claimed that there was an organized and armed opposition to the draft, that menaces and threats were used against officers in the proper discharge of their duties. In some townships, Republicans were terrorized by threats of incendiarism and assault. Officers of the law were in many instances in sympathy with the lawbreakers. Military interference was necessary to restore order and enforce the draft. On the other side, it is claimed that by means of a dishonest enrollment, it was sought to compel Columbia and other Democratic counties to furnish more than just quotas. There was no organized opposition to the draft. A reign of terror prevailed among Democrats, which was instituted by Republicans. Military interference was unnecessary and was resorted to for the purpose of influencing elections. Some of the soldiers sent to the county were guilty of gross outrages, and many innocent men suffered arrest and imprisonment without cause or warrant of law. It would be a difficult matter to prove the exact truth in regard to some of these charges. It is generally admitted, however, that in Columbia County, as in many other parts of the North, some of the Democrats were opposed to the prosecution of the war, that a considerable number of men attempted to evade the draft, and in some places, concert of action was had for that purpose. It is also admitted that the enrollment was very inaccurate, that the force sent here and the large number of arrests were unnecessary, that power placed in the hands of irresponsible subordinates was exercised in a vindictive manner. However, one crucial event remained unresolved: the murder of Lieutenant James Stewart Robertson. Fast forward to 1891, when a civil property dispute in Jackson Township makes waves across the state of Pennsylvania. The two complainants were Frank M. Lutz and Thomas Smith, the same Thomas Smith who evaded Lincoln's midnight raiders the fateful night of July 31st, 1864. During a heated exchange, Lutz claimed Smith knew who killed Lieutenant Robertson. In an effort to get ahead of any negative press, Smith issued a sworn statement accusing Ellis Young of the murder. At the time, Robert P. Robertson, the youngest brother of the slain lieutenant, was the elected sheriff of Luzerne County. Robert's older brother, John, was the deputy. They arrested Young on March 16th and placed him in the Luzerne County Jail. Following his grand jury appearance on April 7th, Young's bail was set for $10,000. 3 Columbia County residents, Warren McHenry, A.J. Durr, and Robert S. Osmond, and 2 men from Luzerne County, Alfred McHenry and Myron Britton, bankrolled Young's release. The criminal trial of Ellis Young began on September 17, 1891. Young's defense was handled by John Lenihan and former Colonel John Fries. During his testimony, Young described how he had been at Miner Smith's home when they suddenly heard a horn blow and a woman scream. They ran in the direction of the noise and met Thomas Smith, who reported the situation. All 3 men took up arms and walked down the road toward Thomas's house. When they encountered the mounted bounty hunters, the shooting started. Ellis specified that Robinson's party had fired first. Attorney John Lenihan described the posse as, quote, a band of lawless young ruffians acting without a vestige of authority. Although, if you recall, there was a provision in the Enrollment Act that allowed civilians to intervene and apprehend draft evaders. Ultimately, after several days of additional character and witness testimony, the court ruled that Young was acting in self-defense and therefore not guilty. And so ends the chapter of the Fishing Creek Confederacy. This story of armed draft resistance and Copperheadism is not unique to Columbia County. There was widespread desertion across the North. In Pennsylvania alone, nearly 21% of draftees evaded conscription, which is an astounding number and quantifies how inefficient these drafts were.
Wow, 21% evaded conscription. Wow. And that's not including people who had the means to kind of buy their way out. That's just people who were ordered to draft, and they just, man, I mean, I would love to like compare that number with other drafts that have taken place in the U.S. and around the world, just to try to see. I wonder what like the I wonder. I feel like that's a study that'd be very interesting. Is the efficiency of the drafting process? We don't. I feel like I've never heard literature about. You kind of hear about the draft dodgers in Vietnam. Some people have fled to Canada, or
that's the most obvious example.
Yeah, and it's but
I don't think 21% of Vietnam draftees evaded.
Yeah, and like even in the Vietnam draft, the rich, it was a similar type of situation where if you had the connections and the strings to pull, those people, they were able to either have a medical reason out or, that same kind of levers of power process. But 21% seems large to me.
A pretty substantial portion.
Wow.
That's like another war on the home front, too.
Yeah. I mean, and it goes to show, too, just, I mean, the concept of a draft, right? You are forcibly compelling your citizens to go to war. I mean, it's just, yeah. I mean, it's just one of those situations where there's so much philosophical, political, and sociological debates that you could have about the ethical implications and the efficacy of drafts, but 21%, it seems like almost begs to wonder, like, what level of efficiency does a nation state need for a draft to be, warranted or, effective? Like 21%. Then you realize all the resources and the soldiers that they had to send to the county just to administer the draft, and it's like, yeah, as you said, a war on the home front. It's interesting. Like what's the net gain from this? I don't know, but
yeah. And I would like to highlight two of the resources I used in my research. So the first one is a history of Columbia County, which was published by Colonel John Fries in 1883. And so I think it was pretty obvious Fries's Democrat affiliations with his quotes.
Oh gosh, yeah.
He was staunchly Democratic, so definitely not unbiased source. But it does provide some interesting firsthand perspective of the Fishing Creek Confederacy. The second source is more contemporary. This is the Fishing Creek Confederacy, A Story of Civil War Draft Resistance by Richard Sars and Peter Tomasak. So it's a really well-written, comprehensive historical analysis of Fishing Creek, and not just Fishing Creek itself, but like Columbia County, central Pennsylvania during the war. What the political attitudes were, and like all the the pretext and post-text stuff that happened.
Yeah. I think and I think what you just said too with those two sources. I mean, I think understanding history, right? There's you need that contemporary. To understand a moment in history, you need to analyze the sources and the thoughts and the intellectual, the sociological, all the different factors that were contemporaneous with that time, right? Because how else could one, even have an understanding of what was happening? But at the same time, as time goes on, and you kind of let's say the more time that passes an event, first, less is at stake, right? But to have an objective analysis of it, generally, you're not going to ruffle as many feathers as you would if you had that same objective analysis in the moment. And you also have that historical clarity of just seeing how these different actions, the effects of them over time. So I think, going off of what you were saying and the whole premise of just understanding history through narratives, I think, it's really beneficial, especially with, events that happened over 150 years ago. You read the sources at the time, and then you also have these sources later on. And through that kind of blend is where you get a better sense of the truth. Because if you try to just understand everything as it's happening in the moment, you have no idea of how the consequences of it. There's no anchor. There's nothing grounding you. It's just you're like a ship, and the waves are just bashing you side to side. But as years go on, you kind of have that anchor. You're steadied a little bit, and you can figure out which way to how to maneuver, how the effects of all these waves bashing against you, and it's just fascinating. Like, some people argue there's no better source of history than the boots on the ground autobiography, biography, but at the same time, as you said, they're all going to be biased because there's such a personal stake. There's so much, risk, or there's so much, whatever, just implication as to what you're doing. It's just fascinating stuff. It's stuff that I feel like people should just always be reminded of, especially in today's. We have too much information to even make sense of what.
And like, I don't think people realize just all the bias that is there.
Everything.
They'll just take it at face value. That's the truth.
And I think it goes to show just anything that's trying to give a contemporaneous understanding of the moment, at the moment at which it is giving that understanding, is going to be inherently biased. It's really, history helps you make sense of things that if you were to only try to review, the sources or the information that's happening at that moment, you'd never get that clarity. It would just seem like, how does this result in that? I have no idea, blah, 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 blah. But just really, really cool stuff. I love that you're using all these different sources from, especially beyond just Democrat, Republican, and even today's day and age, Democrat, Republican, also just, more recent history. History at the time. Like I think we need to just.
There's layers.
Yeah,
there's layers to this.
It's infinite. Yeah, exactly. It's just, and that's what history is. It's all narratives. It's just layers of narratives over time. Over, we can carve people up into as many differences as we want, but time, we're all subject to that, and it's fascinating stuff.
Well, the Fishing Creek Confederacy occurred pretty far behind Union lines. But do you know where the northernmost action of the American Civil War took place? Find out on the next episode of the American Narrative: Histories of a Nation.